They called him Old Frank. Not Mr. Harrison, not sir, just Old Frank. The kind of nickname people give when they've already decided you don't matter. Frank Harrison, 78, worked security at the east entrance of Westbrook Veterans Hospital. Every morning at 5:45 sharp, he arrived in a faded uniform with a patched name tag, a steaming thermos in hand, and a gentle nod for every staff member who passed. Most didn't return it. He walked to work. Always, his stooped shoulders and thinning white hair made him look frail against the morning light. To the doctors and nurses, he was practically invisible, an elderly man with arthritic hands, a clipboard, and outdated ideas. Some whispered jokes behind his back. Others didn't even bother to whisper. Dr. Mitchell, the hospital's new security director, once remarked loudly, "Bet he thinks paper records are more secure than digital files." Frank said nothing. What they didn't know, what no one bothered to ask, was that he once led hundreds of men across hostile territory under moonless skies, that he kept medals in a shoebox under his bed, that his silence wasn't weakness. It was experience choosing not to waste itself. At lunch, he sat alone. Same meal every day. Black coffee, a sandwich, one apple, his notebook always nearby, filled with observations no one knew he was making. He didn't talk much, but he saw everything. Nurse Rachel Santos was one of the few who noticed. She had greeted him respectfully on her first day. He had nodded back without hesitation. "My grandfather said never judge a person by their appearance," she told him one morning. "Wise grandfather," Frank replied quietly. She watched as he moved, measured, precise, never in a hurry. She noticed how he scanned a parking lot when others stared at their phones, how he tested the door locks 3 times before signing out. The others dismissed him, but she saw something else. Not a man stuck in the past, a man waiting. And waiting, she would soon learn, was not an action. It was preparation. By mid-September, the jokes had stopped being subtle. Does Frank even know what a security camera looks like? I swear I heard him ask if the computer needed new batteries. Careful, don't breathe too hard near the old guy. He might break a hip. Staff laughed in passing. Doctors chuckled in break rooms. No one ever said it to Frank's face, but they didn't need to. Their tone said enough. To them, Frank Harrison was harmless, outdated, decorative. He worked the east entrance. He nodded. He drank coffee. That was it. But in truth, it wasn't their words that cut deepest. It was a tone, the casual dismissal, the way they all assumed his time had passed and his value had expired. He was tolerated. Background, a stooped figure in a uniform. Dr. Mitchell always seemed to make a personal sport of it. Young, decorated with credentials, and loud, Mitchell was everything Frank wasn't. He walked fast, spoke sharply, and quoted security protocols like scripture. One afternoon in the staff lounge, Mitchell leaned over his lunch tray and gestured toward the window where Frank could be seen checking the outer doors. "You know," he said, smirking, "I did some digging. Turns out our security guy used to be nothing special. Just a basic grunt, they say." A few nurses laughed, relieved they weren't the target. "You sure?" another asked. "Positive," Mitchell said confidently. "That's why he keeps that notebook, so he doesn't forget which door is which." More laughter. From the corner, Nurse Rachel Santos said nothing, but she watched. The following day, Frank was fixing the old keycard reader outside the pharmacy wing. The system had been acting up for weeks, but no one else bothered with it. Frank quietly, without request, had brought his tools and gone to work. As he knelt there, his aged hands working methodically despite their slight tremor, a pair of polished shoes approached. "Dr. Mitchell, need help, old-timer?" he asked, arms crossed, mock concern dripping from every syllable. Frank looked up, then returned to adjusting a loose wire. "No," he said simply. "No, sir," Mitchell corrected, half laughing. "We do still use proper titles around here." Frank stood slowly, not defensive, just calm. "Didn't realize security duty required formalities," he said. Mitchell leaned in slightly. "Everything requires respect, especially from help." For a long moment, the two men just stood there, one puffed up, full of youthful certainty, the other still as stone. Frank finally spoke, Respect isn't given by titles. It's revealed by silence. Mitchell scoffed. Yeah, well, silence doesn't stop intruders. Then he walked away. That evening, Rachel walked past the security office and found Frank alone, sipping his coffee and making notes by dim light. She hesitated at the door. I heard what Mitchell said, she began softly. He doesn't know you. Frank didn't look up. He doesn't need to, but he should, she said. Frank turned to her then. His eyes were calm but serious beneath his wrinkled brow. I'm not here to be known, he said. I'm here to see what others miss. She nodded, unsure what to say next. Before she could turn to leave, he added, they always laugh until they can't afford to. The next day, during a routine security check, the hospital's digital access system glitched, allowing temporary unrestricted access to the medication storage. A failure barely noticeable to most, but enough to create a severe security vulnerability. Dr. Mitchell blamed technical interference. Staff grumbled about system updates. But Frank was already at the main security panel that morning, examining the access logs. He made no announcement, no accusations. Instead, he manually reviewed the system, noting 3 separate anomalies the automated checks had failed to detect for weeks. By noon, he had quietly reconfigured the security protocols. Mitchell took credit for the fix in front of administration. Frank said nothing, but Rachel saw. She always did. By week's end, something began to shift, not with Mitchell or the doctors, but among some of the nurses and staff. A few started greeting Frank by name. Some asked quiet questions about building layouts or security measures. One even stopped by the office and awkwardly asked if Frank had ever served in the military. Frank only smiled, long enough to answer, short enough to know better. And still, the mockery persisted. Mitchell continued holding court with his backslapping confidence and derisive humor. He talked about security threats like they were theoretical exercises. He barked commands like volume proved worth. But Rachel had started listening to someone else, watching someone else. Because while others laughed at the man who took his time checking locks, she realized something important. The ones who move slowly often see what others miss. One evening, as Frank made his final rounds, she noticed something unusual. The slightest pause as he passed the server room, a brief narrowing of his eyes as he glanced at the keypad. Nothing dramatic, just a moment of focused attention that seemed out of place. Is something wrong? She asked. He considered her question carefully before answering. Not yet. It happened on a Thursday, just before dusk. As the hospital prepared for evening shift change, the security system glitched. Only for a moment, a flicker on the pharmacy wing camera. Most would have missed it. Frank didn't. He reviewed the footage, eyes narrowing. A shadow moved where it shouldn't have. No sound, no alert, just a quiet disturbance near the loading dock. He called it in. Possible security breach, East Wing. Recommend investigation. Dr. Mitchell's voice crackled back, dismissive. No confirmation. Probably just maintenance staff. We're not chasing shadows, Frank. But Frank didn't dismiss it. Instead, he signed out for a maintenance check and walked the perimeter with his flashlight, his stooped frame moving purposefully despite the ache in his joints. The air was damp, heavy, still. He found what he was looking for near the service entrance. Fingerprints on the keypad that shouldn't be there. Not hospital staff. The pattern was wrong, methodical, testing. Too precise to ignore. The next day, he filed a report, not through the normal channels. He knew better. Just a folded note on Dr. Langston's desk, the hospital director. Security protocols compromised. Electronic access vulnerable. There was no response. But that night, the breach returned. 2 figures appeared briefly on the loading dock camera, their movements quick and deliberate, gone before the motion sensors triggered. And Frank, watching from his office, knew in his bones this wasn't a coincidence anymore. Over the next 3 days, strange anomalies appeared throughout the hospital systems. Medication inventory numbers that didn't match. Patient records briefly accessed at odd hours. Nothing obvious enough to trigger alarms, but forming a pattern to the trained eye. Frank documented everything in his notebook. Times, locations, methods. He adjusted his own rounds, arriving earlier, staying later, his aged body protesting but his mind sharp as ever. When he tried to show Mitchell the evidence, the response was cutting. For God's sake, Frank, not everyone with a key card is a spy. This isn't the Cold War anymore. Frank simply closed his notebook and walked away. That evening, he placed a second note on Dr. Langston's desk. 72 hours. Targeted breach imminent. No one responded, but he didn't expect them to. The young rarely listen until the damage is done. He would be ready anyway. The fourth breach came with no warning. No blaring alarms, no flashing lights. Just a system failure. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Westbrook Veterans Hospital went dark. Power remained, but every electronic system crashed simultaneously. Security access, patient monitoring, medication dispensing, all offline. For 13 full minutes, the entire hospital network was blind. Night staff scrambled. Some thought it was a server update. Others blamed the aging infrastructure. Only one man understood the truth before anyone else did. Frank Harrison was already moving. He hadn't slept. He never did when patterns aligned. While others tried rebooting computers, Frank was checking the pharmaceutical storage areas. His flashlight beam swept methodically across the rooms despite his trembling hands. At the research pharmacy, he stopped. The electronic lock showed green when it should have been red. He pressed his weathered hand against the door. It swung open easily. Inside, two figures in maintenance uniforms were efficiently transferring experimental medications into specialized containers. When Frank's light hit them, they froze. Security breach, Frank said into his radio, his voice calm despite the static. The system failure had compromised communications. The intruders moved quickly, one reaching beneath his jacket. Frank stood his ground, his stooped frame suddenly straighter, his eyes clear and focused. Dr. Mitchell arrived with two security guards, bursting into pharmacy with unnecessary noise and confusion. Freeze! Security! He shouted, flashlight beam darting wildly. The intruders exchanged glances, calculating odds. 8 seconds, Frank said quietly, almost conversationally. That's how long before tactical response arrives. I called them first. The larger intruder narrowed his eyes. You're bluffing, old man. Frank met his gaze steadily. 5th Regiment, Force Recon. Never bluff. Something in his tone, in his stance despite his age, made them hesitate just long enough. The hospital's backup systems finally engaged. Lights flickered on, and with them, the sound of multiple footsteps approaching rapidly. The intruder surrendered without further resistance. As federal agents secured the scene, Dr. Mitchell stared at Frank in confusion. How did you know? Frank reached into his pocket and produced his notebook, opened the pages of precise documentation. Times, patterns, security vulnerabilities, meticulously charted over weeks. You were warned, he said simply. You chose not to listen. Mitchell's face flushed with shame and anger. You should have been more insistent. Frank met his gaze. You weren't ready to hear. Then he walked out, past staff members who now watched him with new eyes. The morning after the breach, Westbrook felt different. Not because of the increased security or the FBI agents still processing evidence, but because no one could quite look at Frank Harrison the same way. They tried. Mitchell pretended nothing had changed. Staff returned to routines. But whispers moved faster than medicine carts. He knew. He had it all documented. That notebook wasn't just scribbles. Someone had seen a page, a hand-drawn map of the hospital with breach intervals calculated down to the second. Another heard one of the federal agents murmur the word colonel. That afternoon, a black government SUV arrived. No sirens, no commotion, just a vehicle and a woman in a tailored suit who walked straight to the director's office. Inside, Mitchell stood reviewing the incident reports, desperately searching for some defense, some way to explain his dismissal of multiple warnings. The woman didn't ask permission to enter. She spoke clearly. You dismissed multiple security alerts. Mitchell stiffened. We had no verified threat assessment. You had Frank Harrison, she replied. Mitchell flinched. With all due respect, he said, he's a security guard. The woman opened a folder. Inside was a single photograph. A younger man, straighter posture, fuller hair, but unmistakably Frank. He stood in desert combat gear beside military officials. "Then why?" she said, laying the photo on the desk. "Is he standing in Fallujah as a commanding officer of the most successful special operations unit in Marine history?" The room went still. Mitchell's face drained of color. "What?" "Colonel Frank Harrison," the woman continued, her tone unchanged, "led force reconnaissance operations in 3 combat theaters, developed the threat assessment protocols your agency still uses. The only reason this hospital isn't on the national news is because a man you dismissed as old still did the job you were too proud to learn." She closed the folder. "You've been relieved of security oversight, effective immediately." Outside, Frank stood at his post as usual, nodding at each staff member who passed. Only now, the nods came back with more weight, more hesitation, more understanding. Rachel approached with a small, respectful smile. "Sir," she said, voice firm, "they're saying you wrote the security manuals they use to train federal agents." Frank gave a small shrug. "Someone had to." She smiled. "Then maybe it's time we actually followed them." The hospital held no ceremony. No speeches, no plaques, just a mandatory staff meeting in the main conference room. Every seat was filled. Staff members sat in silence. Administrators stood in the back. The podium remained empty longer than expected. Then Dr. Langston entered with the woman in the suit. "Colonel Frank Harrison," Langston began. "Some of you knew him as just old Frank. A man you overlooked, a man you dismissed." She let the silence settle before continuing. "You mocked experience. You ignored expertise. And you almost paid the price. No one dared move. He prevented a major breach with no weapons, no title, just judgment earned over decades. Judgment that was silenced by arrogance." Then she stepped back, and Frank walked in, same uniform, same measured steps. He said nothing at first, just looked out at the room that had once seen him as invisible. "I didn't stop the breach to prove anything," he said finally. "I did it because it was my duty, and you protect what's in front of you." A pause. That's what leadership is. Not credentials, not volume. It's seeing what others miss when everyone else is looking elsewhere. He turned to leave, then stopped. "And if any of you want to learn that, really learn it, I'll be at my post." Later that week, a new plaque was mounted at the east entrance. "Harrison Security Office," in simple letters. Frank didn't ask for it, didn't even comment, but when he passed it, coffee in hand, he did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled, just a little. Frank never said goodbye. No announcement, no retirement party. One morning, the east entrance simply opened without him. A note was left behind, folded neatly on the desk. "The watch never ends. It just changes hands." And with that, he was gone. They searched for him at first, called, emailed. No answer. But every staff member, every administrator knew it wasn't a disappearance. It was a passing of the torch. Rachel Santos now stood where Frank once did. Same careful attention, same steady gaze. And beside her, pinned inside the office, was Frank's notebook, open to the final page. 6 words. "Respect is earned in silence daily." No lectures, no protocols, just a sentence that had become wisdom. Months passed. New staff arrived. They heard the stories. How a quiet, elderly security guard once outsmarted professional thieves, saved valuable research, and changed the hospital's culture with a single notebook. Most thought it was just legend until they met Rachel, until they saw how she paused before every decision, how she checked the perimeter before sunrise, how she trained new security personnel, not in procedures, but in observation. She never raised her voice, but somehow they listened. On a quiet spring afternoon, a postal delivery arrived at the security office, a box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, a folded security uniform, untouched, and a note scribbled in familiar handwriting. "For whoever watches next, make it count." No return address, no signature, just a legacy they never saw coming but would never forget. Frank Harrison was never one for speeches. He never told people to respect him, never demanded attention, Never once said, "I used to be somebody." But he didn't have to, because every day, in every quiet choice, he lived by 5 words he rarely spoke aloud. Look beyond what you see. He showed it when he stood at his post in the early morning hours when no one noticed. He showed it when he didn't retaliate against the mockery. He showed it when he warned them, gently, quietly, of the breach they chose not to believe. And he showed it most clearly when, after the truth came out, he refused the spotlight, refused the accolades. He didn't need to reclaim his rank. He had already reclaimed their respect. At Westbrook Veterans Hospital, they still call it the Harrison Security Office. New staff members learn the story during orientation, not through a slideshow or a commemorative speech, but by learning to observe first and act second, just like Frank did. Rachel, now security director, keeps his notebook sealed in a glass case, not to preserve it, but to remind everyone that leadership isn't loud. It listens, it waits, it observes, and when it speaks, it means something. So no, Frank Harrison rarely said those 5 words, but the hospital still echoes with them. In every thoughtful pause, in every respectful greeting, in every leader who learns that true authority comes not from position, but from the wisdom to see what others miss. Comment below if you've ever experienced someone being underestimated because of their age or appearance. What hidden strengths or wisdom did they reveal? Respect the elderly. They've seen more than we can imagine.